At sunrise, the Colosseum was already awake. Its arches caught the first pale light of morning, while shadows still clung to the stone corridors below. Vendors were arriving before the crowd had even taken their seats, carrying baskets of olives, bread, watered wine, and small comforts for a day built around discomfort. Above them, the great amphitheater waited like a machine that had learned how to breathe. Beneath the stands, iron gates groaned. Handlers moved animals through narrow passages. Guards checked locks. Men tested blades against wood and stone. Prisoners waited in holding spaces where the sounds from above were already beginning to swell. At first, the crowd was only a murmur. Then footsteps multiplied. Then voices rose. Then the entire building seemed to hum with expectation. Tens of thousands of Romans were entering, not for theater alone, not for sport alone, not even for punishment alone, but for something Rome had turned into a public language, suffering arranged as spectacle. The arena was not simply entertainment, it was a classroom of power. It taught the poor who ruled them. It reminded citizens what happened to enemies. It turned conquered peoples into bodies on sand. It transformed punishment into applause. It allowed emperors to appear generous while making cruelty feel normal, festive, even patriotic. Rome did not invent violence, but Rome perfected the art of dressing violence in ceremony. The games could begin with music, banners, priests, officials, gifts, and public excitement. But beneath all that color was a darker truth. The arena was where the empire rehearsed domination in front of itself. Every beast dragged from a distant province, every prisoner forced into costume, every fighter armed for a contest he could barely survive, every execution staged like myth, told the same story. Rome could command life, Rome could command death, and Rome could make the crowd cheer for both. If you are drawn to the darker corners of history, subscribe to Grimmer History and help us reach 45,000 subscribers. Every story here is built to uncover the past, with atmosphere, tension, and respect for the lives history tried to bury. Today, we step into the shadow beneath the marble, not to admire the arena, but to understand what it cost. The first gladiatorial combat in Rome did not begin as imperial entertainment. It began with the dead. In 264 BC, at the funeral of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever, his sons honored him, not with quiet mourning alone, but with blood. 3 pairs of men were armed and made to fight in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market of Rome. This was not yet the Colosseum. There were no massive stone tiers, no imperial machinery, no carefully staged days of slaughter. There was a funeral, there was a crowd, and there were men forced to fight as an offering. The Romans called such a duty a munus, an obligation owed. In its earliest form, gladiatorial combat was connected to funeral honor, memory, and the idea that blood given in combat could satisfy the dead or glorify the family who arranged it. The custom may have drawn from older Italian practices, where combat and death could be bound together in ritual. But Rome had a talent for transformation. What began as a private funeral offering became public display. What began as duty became prestige. What began as a limited ritual became a tool of politics. A wealthy family that sponsored gladiators did more than honor the dead. It showed influence. It gathered a crowd. It demonstrated generosity. It made the public remember a name. In Rome, memory was power, and no memory was louder than one written in fear and applause. Soon, politicians understood what the funeral families had discovered. The crowd wanted spectacle, and whoever gave it to them could purchase loyalty. Religious festivals and public games began to include gladiatorial combat. The language remained pious. The rituals still wore the clothing of tradition, but the meaning was changing. Men were no longer fighting only for the dead. They were fighting for public emotion, political favor, and the ambition of those who paid for the show. Even the fighters' appearances carried propaganda. Some gladiators were dressed in styles associated with Rome's defeated enemies. The Samnite, the Thracian, the Gaul, and others appeared not only as combatants, but as living reminders of conquest. When they clashed on the sand, Rome watched its victories repeated in miniature. The arena turned history into performance. The conquered enemy returned, again and again, only to be defeated before Roman eyes. As the games grew, so did the spaces built for them. Temporary wooden structures gave way to permanent amphitheaters. Crowds expanded. Programs became more elaborate. What had once belonged to the rituals of mourning became part of the machinery of the state. And once the state took hold of the games, the appetite changed. It was no longer enough to see two men fight. The crowd wanted variety. The sponsors wanted reputation. The emperors wanted awe. So Rome began to ask a question that every brutal entertainment eventually asks. What else can be done? The answer came in animals, prisoners, staged myths, naval battles, strange weapons, rigged contests, and punishments designed not only to kill, but to impress. This was the beginning of the arena's descent, not a sudden collapse into cruelty, but a gradual expansion of what people could watch without turning away. The crowd's roar was not reserved for men. Sometimes it rose for animals, dragged from the farthest edges of the empire. Romans called these spectacles venationes, hunts, but the word hides the reality. These were not hunts in the wild. They were controlled displays of domination, arranged inside stone walls for an audience that wanted to see the empire conquer nature itself. Lions came from North Africa. Leopards and panthers came from distant mountains and forests. Crocodiles came from the Nile. Bears, bulls, elephants, ostriches, and strange creatures most Romans would never otherwise see were transported across deserts, seas, and roads so they could appear for a few minutes on sand. To the crowd, they were wonders. To Rome, they were proof. Every animal represented reach. Every cage represented conquest. Every beast that entered the arena told the audience that the empire could stretch its hand into the wild world, seize what lived there, and bring it back for Roman pleasure. Julius Caesar famously displayed a giraffe in Rome, an animal so unfamiliar that people struggled to name it. Later emperors staged hunts on even greater scales. When the Colosseum was inaugurated under Titus in AD 80, ancient sources claim that thousands of animals died during the celebrations. The exact numbers are debated, but the message is not. Rome wanted abundance to look effortless. Behind the scenes, it was anything but effortless. Animals had to be captured alive, chained, transported, fed, guarded, and delivered. Men risked death simply bringing them to Rome. Provinces were drained of wildlife. Local ecosystems suffered. Ancient writers themselves sometimes noticed the scale of destruction. To feed the arena, the empire consumed not only human lives, but the living world around it. Yet the crowd saw only spectacle. A gate opened, a creature emerged, a hunter stepped forward, and the arena became a map of conquest. Some emperors turned these hunts into personal theater. Commodus, obsessed with appearing as a living Hercules, entered the arena to kill animals himself. But imperial courage in the arena was often carefully arranged. Animals could be weakened, restrained, or positioned so the emperor's victory was never truly in doubt. The crowd cheered anyway. Because in Rome, applause could be survival. When an emperor performed power, silence was dangerous. The animal hunts revealed one of the arena's deepest functions. They made domination beautiful. They made conquest visible. They transformed the destruction of life into a sign that Rome was favored, mighty, and limitless. But Rome's appetite was not satisfied by animals alone. The arena also demanded men. And not all men who entered the sand were trained gladiators. Some were condemned prisoners. Some were captives of war. Some were rebels, slaves, deserters, or people Rome wanted to make into warnings. They were not given a fair contest. They were placed inside a public lesson. The arena blurred the line between sport and execution. A trained gladiator had a role, a style, a school, and sometimes a chance of survival. He could become famous. He could earn admiration. He could even, rarely, win freedom. But the condemned had no such path. They entered not as athletes, but as examples. Rome called certain punishments damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The phrase sounds legal, almost clean. The reality was terror performed for an audience. Prisoners could be sent into the arena with no real defense. They might be placed before animals, exposed to staged dangers, or forced into scenes where the ending had already been decided. Their death was not only punishment, it was communication. The crowd was meant to understand. This is what happens to rebels. This is what happens to criminals. This is what happens to those outside Rome's protection. Public punishment became moral theater. The condemned person was stripped of individuality and turned into a symbol of disorder, being destroyed before the eyes of the community. That was the arena's genius and its cruelty. It made the state look like justice, and it made the crowd feel righteous while watching suffering. By midday, when the morning events had already stirred the audience, the arena often changed its rhythm. The serious contests gave way to executions. These were not always quick. They were designed to hold attention. Rome understood pacing. It knew how to vary fear, suspense, and shock. The crowd had to be kept awake. The emperor's generosity had to be felt. The sponsor's wealth had to be remembered. So punishment became theater. Prisoners were sometimes forced to reenact myths, legends, or famous scenes, but with real consequences. A condemned man might be dressed as a doomed figure from a story. Another might be placed in a constructed scene designed to imitate divine punishment or heroic downfall. The audience, familiar with the myth, knew what was coming. The horror came from watching fiction become real. Rome did not merely kill the condemned, it made them perform the meaning of their deaths. This was one of the most disturbing inventions of the arena. Stories that once belonged to poetry, religion, or cultural memory were dragged into the sand and turned into scripts of humiliation. The condemned had no artistic role. They had no choice. They were assigned a character and forced to become the ending. The poet Martial, writing about the spectacles at the opening of the Colosseum, described performances where myth and execution merged. His tone could be clever, even playful, but beneath the wit was a world in which human beings were turned into props for imperial wonder. Beauty was twisted into punishment. Myth became machinery. The gods became costumes. Rome was not content to rule bodies. It wanted to rule stories too. This desire reached even greater extremes in mock naval battles, called naumachii. These events were among the most astonishing and terrifying spectacles Rome ever staged. Julius Caesar created an artificial basin for a naval display. Augustus later built a huge basin for another. Claudius staged a vast naval spectacle on Lake Fucinus. Thousands of condemned men could be placed aboard ships and ordered to fight as if they were fleets in war. To the crowd, it was breathtaking. To the participants, it was hopeless. Imagine being forced into a ship, not because you are a sailor, not because you fight for a kingdom, but because an emperor wants to show that he can create a sea where there should be none. The water itself becomes a stage. The ships become cages. The battle becomes a performance in which survival was never the point. The message was imperial. Rome could command land. Rome could command animals. Rome could command men. Rome could even command water to become a battlefield. Architecture and engineering served cruelty. Basins were dug. Aqueducts carried water. Gates opened. Channels filled. The same civilization that built roads, bridges, baths, and temples could turn that technical genius toward spectacles of death. This is why the arena cannot be separated from Roman greatness. It was not an accident beside civilization. It was part of the same civilization. The same discipline that organized legions organized games. The same engineering that moved water for cities moved water for spectacles. The same law that arranged citizenship arranged punishment. The same public order that built forums also built amphitheaters. Rome's refinement and Rome's brutality were not opposites. They stood side by side. That is what makes the arena so unsettling. It was not chaos. It was administration. The deeper the empire moved into spectacle, the more it demanded novelty. A crowd trained to watch violence becomes difficult to satisfy. What shocked them once becomes ordinary. What once seemed extreme becomes expected. Sponsors and emperors had to outdo those who came before them. More animals, more prisoners, more elaborate sets, more unusual matchups, more dangerous machinery, more expensive shows. This hunger helped produce some of the strangest and most inhumane performances in Roman public life. Gladiatorial combat itself could be structured around imbalance. Different types of fighters carried different weapons and armor. Some matchups were designed to create tension through contrast. Speed against weight, distance against closeness, net against sword, exposed flesh against heavy protection. The retiarius, with net and trident, faced opponents whose equipment was designed to resist him. The secutor wore a smooth helmet meant to avoid entanglement. The fight was not random. It was designed like drama. Each fighter represented a problem the other had to solve. The crowd loved uncertainty. But uncertainty did not always mean fairness. Some contests were arranged to favor one side. Some participants were poorly trained. Some were condemned men forced into the appearance of combat without the real preparation of gladiators. Others wore equipment that limited vision, movement, or endurance. What seemed like sport could become a carefully disguised execution. Women also entered the arena. Female gladiators, known today as gladiatrices, are attested in Roman sources and inscriptions. Though they were rare, their presence fascinated and disturbed Roman writers. Some mocked them, others treated them as curiosities, but the fact that they appeared at all reveals the arena's hunger for novelty. Nothing was beyond display if it could shock the crowd. Not gender, not status, not myth, not nature, not punishment. Everything could be turned into spectacle, and emperors understood the political value of that shock. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, and others used public performance to shape fear, loyalty, and fascination. Some appeared in or manipulated the games in ways that blurred the line between ruler and performer. Commodus, especially, turned the arena into a stage for his own image. He presented himself as Hercules, fought in controlled circumstances, and demanded admiration for victories arranged in advance. The arena allowed emperors to perform power in a language everyone understood. A speech could be questioned, a law could be debated, but a body on the sand and an emperor above it made hierarchy visible. That visibility mattered. The crowd knew who sat where. Senators had their places, knights had theirs. Common citizens had theirs. Women, foreigners, and the poor were assigned by status. Even attendance became a map of Roman society. The arena showed not only who died, but who watched, where they watched from, and how close they sat to power. Every game taught order. The emperor at the center, the crowd arranged by rank, the condemned below. The empire gathered into one building, and when the crowd shouted together, it became something more than entertainment. It became a ritual of belonging. To cheer was to participate. To watch was to be Roman. To accept the suffering below was to accept the order above. That was the deepest cruelty of the arena. It made ordinary people part of the machine. Not every Roman approved. Some writers expressed discomfort, disgust, or moral anxiety. Seneca described the effect of midday executions on the soul, warning that watching cruelty could make the viewer more cruel. Cicero could admire courage while still recognizing the ugliness of violence for pleasure. Later Christian writers condemned the games as corrupting, brutal, and spiritually dangerous. But the protests were small against the roar. The arena endured because it served too many purposes at once. It entertained the masses. It punished the condemned. It displayed imperial wealth. It advertised conquest. It trained citizens to associate suffering with justice, domination with order, and spectacle with belonging. It made cruelty feel normal. That is why the Colosseum still disturbs us, not because violence happened there. Human violence has stained every civilization. The Colosseum disturbs us because the violence was organized so beautifully. Stone arches, seating plans, ticket systems, processions, engineering, public holidays, imperial generosity, mythological scenes, exotic animals, ritualized combat, punishment arranged into schedule and sequence. Cruelty was not hidden in darkness. It was placed at the center of the city and given an audience. Today, the Colosseum stands silent. Tourists walk its corridors. Cameras rise where crowds once shouted. The sand is gone. The underground passages are exposed. The building has become a monument, a ruin, a symbol of Rome's power and human endurance. But stone can deceive. If we admire only the architecture, we miss the warning. Rome's arenas were not merely places where people died. They were places where a civilization practiced how to feel about death. They trained the crowd to laugh, cheer, judge, and demand more. They transformed the suffering of prisoners, slaves, animals, and fighters into public pleasure. And once a society learns to enjoy domination as entertainment, it becomes harder to know where the arena ends. That is the lesson carved into the ruins. A civilization can be brilliant and brutal at the same time. It can build roads and normalize cruelty. It can write laws and silence the powerless. It can raise monuments that last for millennia while burying the names of those who paid for them in fear. The Colosseum is quiet now, but its silence is not empty. It asks a question that still belongs to every age. How much suffering can a people watch before they begin to mistake it for glory? And how long can any civilization survive once applause becomes louder than mercy?